2 weeks had passed since Yuna first saw Tivy picking through garbage in the shadows of Nexus Station. Each day she returned to the same spot with food, and each day Tivy appeared like a small ghost emerging from the darkness. Their conversations were brief at first because Tivy had learned that talking too much could be dangerous and trusting anyone could be fatal. But humans were patient creatures when they cared about something, and Yuna cared about this frightened child more than she could explain even to herself. On the 15th day, Tivy asked Yuna if she wanted to meet the others. Yuna felt her heart skip at the question because she had hoped for this moment, but had not dared to ask. She nodded and followed Tivy into the party's maintenance tunnels that snaked through the station's lower levels, like a maze designed by someone who hated people who needed to find their way. The tunnels were dark and cramped and smelled of recycled air and leaking coolant and desperation. Tivy moved through them with the confidence of someone who had memorized every turn and every hiding spot and every place where a small body could squeeze through while a larger pursuer could not. After 20 minutes of walking, they reached a section of the tunnels that opened into a larger space where pipes converged and ancient machinery hummed with mechanical exhaustion. And there Yuna saw them 40 Kethri survivors living in a settlement built from salvaged materials and broken dreams. They had constructed shelters from discarded packing crates and torn fabric and pieces of metal that no longer served any official purpose. Children sat in clusters playing quiet games that made no noise because noise attracted attention, and attention meant danger. Adults worked at various tasks with the focused intensity of people who knew that every moment of productivity might mean the difference between surviving another day or giving up entirely. They all froze when they saw Yuna. Large, dark eyes turned toward her with expressions of fear and suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Tivy squeezed Yuna's hand and led her forward to where an elderly Kethri sat on a makeshift chair that had probably once been part of a cargo container. This was Elder Soharan, and Yuna could see immediately that he carried the weight of his people's survival on shoulders that had grown thin with age and hunger. His scales had lost some of their iridescence, and his antennae drooped with weariness, but his eyes remained sharp and alert and deeply suspicious of the human woman his granddaughter had brought into their sanctuary. "Why are you here?" he asked, in a voice that cracked like old leather. Yuna thought carefully before answering, because she understood that wrong words could destroy the fragile trust Tivy had placed in her. "I wanted to help," she said. Elder Soharan made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. Many have said those words before he replied, and each time it ended with betrayal or demands we could not meet or promises broken like thin ice beneath heavy feet. "What do you want from us, human?" Yuna looked around at the settlement and saw things that made her stomach clench with anger and sorrow. She saw children with scales that had grown dull from malnutrition. She saw adults coughing from the contaminated air they breathed. She saw water containers filled with recycled coolant that had been filtered through cloth in a desperate attempt to make it safe to drink. "I do not want anything from you," she said. "I want to know what you need, Elder." Soharan studied her for a long moment, and Yuna felt as if he was looking into her soul, searching for the deception he expected to find. "We need everything," he finally said with exhaustion bleeding through every word. "We need clean water and food that does not come from garbage bins, and medicine for the sick, and protection from station security, and a place where our children can grow up without learning to hide like animals. We need someone to care that we exist, but we have nothing to offer in return. The Kethri do not have wealth or power or influence. We are small and weak, and the galaxy has decided we do not matter." Yuna knelt down so she was at eye level with Elder Soharan and spoke words that had been building inside her for weeks. "Where I come from," she said, "we have a concept called dignity. It means that every thinking, feeling being has value simply because they exist, not because of what they can produce or what they can pay or how strong they are. but because they are alive and aware and capable of suffering and joy. Tivi's antenna perked up at these words, and she moved closer. To listen, Elder Soharan's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. Value without utility, he repeated as if testing strange sounds in his mouth. This is a human concept. It is Yuna confirmed, and it is why I am here. I cannot promise to save all of you. I cannot undo what was done to your world, but I can bring food and water and medicine. I can tell others about you. I can try to find a better solution. I can do these things because your children deserve to eat real food and your elders deserve to rest without fear, and your people deserve to be seen as people, not as vermin hiding in the walls. Elder Soharan was quiet for a long time. Around them, the other Kethri had gathered to listen, and Yuna could feel their eyes on her like physical weight. Finally, the old man spoke again. You may help us if you wish, he said, but I warn you, human. If you betray us, there will be nothing we can do to punish you. We have no strength to fight and no allies to avenge us. If you hurt us, you will face no consequences at all. That is the truth of our existence. Yuna nodded and felt tears threatening to fall, because she understood exactly what he meant. The powerless could not even threaten retaliation. They could only hope that those with power would choose kindness. I understand, she said, and I will not betray you. She spent 3 hours in the settlement, learning names and faces and stories and needs. She made lists in her mind of supplies she could purchase and contacts she might call in, favors she might beg from the small network of human traders she had built over 15 years in space. When she finally prepared to leave, Tivi walked with her back through the tunnels. At the exit point were the maintenance corridors connected to the public areas of the station. They stopped. Yuna knelt down and looked into Tivi's large dark eyes. I will come back tomorrow, she promised, but something flickered in Tivi's expression, fear that had never really left. What if you do not, she asked in a small voice. Yuna reached out and gently touched the child's shoulder. Then you will survive without me, she said, because you are strong and brave, and your people have endured things that would have broken others. But I will come back, I promised. Tivi nodded and disappeared into the tunnels. Yuna emerged into the public corridor and immediately noticed something wrong. Station security drones were flying in patrol patterns she had not seen before, and personnel and official uniforms were scanning areas with equipment that looked new and expensive. She stopped a passing worker and asked what was happening. Big trade delegation coming next week, the worker said. Administrator Vreen has ordered a full sweep of the lower levels, cleaning out the garbage, he called it, making the station presentable for important visitors. Yuna felt ice form in her stomach. She knew what cleaning out the garbage meant. It meant finding people who were not supposed to be there. People like 40 Kethri refugees hiding in the maintenance tunnels. People like one small girl who had finally started to believe that someone cared about her. Yuna ran back to her ship and began making calls. She had very little time and even less power. But she had something that the galaxy often underestimated. She had the stubborn determination of a human who had decided that a child's life mattered more than rules or consequences or her own survival. And she would not stop until Tivi was safe. 6 months had passed since Yuna stood in Administrator Vreen's office and demanded protection for 40 Kethri refugees. 6 months of negotiations and paperwork and calls to every contact she had ever made, and favors begged from people who owed her nothing. 6 months of hope and setbacks and small victories and crushing disappointments, but they had done it. Havens Rest was a human frontier colony on a world that was still being settled and developed. The colony's leaders had listened to Yuna's request and asked questions and debated among themselves. Some had argued that resources were already stretched thin and they could not afford to take on refugees who would need food and shelter and support. But others had spoken up. They talked about human history and the times when their own ancestors had been the ones fleeing persecution and seeking safety. They talked about the kind of community they wanted to build, and whether that community would turn away children in need. In the end, they voted to accept the Kethri refugees as neighbors and future citizens, not as charity cases to be tolerated, but as new members of their growing society with rights and responsibilities and a place at the table. The transition had not been easy. Cultural misunderstandings arose almost immediately. The Kethri were accustomed to hiding and apologizing for their existence and taking up as little space as possible. The humans kept insisting that they did not need to hide and that their presence was welcome and that they should take what they needed without guilt. Some human colonists complained that resources were being shared with aliens when human settlers still struggled. Yuna worked tirelessly to bridge the gaps, organizing exchange programs where the Kethri shared their expertise in precision engineering and delicate mechanical work while humans taught agricultural techniques suited to their new world. Slowly, the two species learned to see each other as partners rather than strangers. The Kethri children enrolled in the colony school alongside human children, and within weeks, they were playing together and learning together and forming friendships that their parents watched with wonder. Tivi had transformed the frightened ghost who had eaten garbage in the shadows of Nexus Station was gone. In her place stood a young Kethri girl whose scales gleamed with health and whose antennae stood proud and alert. She had grown taller and stronger, and her large dark eyes now held curiosity and excitement instead of fear. She was learning to read human languages and studying mathematics and asking endless questions about everything she encountered. Yuna visited the colony regularly, bringing supplies and news and the kind of practical help that settlers always needed. Each time she arrived, Tivi ran to meet her with enthusiastic greetings and stories about everything that had happened since her last visit. On this particular visit, a community gathering had been organized to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Kethri arrival. Humans and Kethri gathered together, sharing food and music and stories from both cultures. Elder Soharan found Yuna standing at the edge of the celebration, watching the mixed crowd with a smile on her face. He approached slowly and stood beside her in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke in Kethri culture. "We have a concept that is difficult to translate into your language. We call it being soul-seen." Yuna turned to look at him with curiosity. "Soul-seen," she repeated. Elder Soharan nodded. "It means that someone has recognized your true nature. When everyone else sees only your circumstances, it means being known deeply and truly in a way that goes beyond surface appearances. It is considered one of the most profound gifts one being can give another." Yuna was not sure where this was going, but she listened carefully. "When you first saw Tivi," Elder Soharan continued, "you did not see a refugee or a burden or a problem to be solved. You did not see a member of a weak species with nothing to offer. You did not see garbage eating garbage. You saw a child who deserved to be fed and protected and loved. You saw a person of value in a galaxy that had decided she was worthless. You soul saw her." Yuna felt tears threatening to fall as she blinked them back. "Anyone would have done the same," she said. Elder Soharan shook his head. "No, they would not. I have lived many years and traveled to many places and met many species. Most beings see only what is useful to them. Most beings calculate value before they offer kindness. You did not. And because you soul saw one child, you soul saw all of us. You looked at our people and did not see vermin hiding in the walls. You saw families and elders and children who had lost everything except each other. You saw us, the Kethri, have decided to honor you in a way that has not been offered to an outsider in many generations. We name you kin to our people. You carry our gratitude and our loyalty and our love from this day until the stars grow cold." Yuna found that she could not speak. Tears were falling now, and she did not try to stop them. Tivi came running up to them with excitement in her eyes. She had clearly been waiting for this moment. She grabbed Yuna's hand and looked up at her with that bright, confident gaze that was so different from the frightened animal eyes Yuna remembered from Their first meeting. You told me once that I was precious, Tivy said. Do you remember? Yuna nodded. I remember, Tivy smiled. You were wrong about one thing. Yuna wiped her eyes and asked what she meant. You called me a princess, Tivy said. But I have been thinking about princesses, and I decided I do not want to be one. Why not? Yuna asked. Because princesses sit in towers and wait for someone to rescue them. Tivy said, I do not want to wait. I want to be like you. I want to find the next forgotten child and soul, see them the way you saw me. I want to spend my life making sure that no one ever has to eat garbage alone in the dark while the galaxy pretends they do not exist. Yuna knelt down and wrapped her arms around Tivy and held her close. Then that is exactly what you will do, she whispered, and you will be magnificent. Years passed. Tivy grew into a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence and fierce compassion. She trained in emergency response and interspecies diplomacy, and all the skills she would need to help people who had no one else. Eventually, she joined the crew of a mixed species humanitarian vessel that traveled to crisis zones across the galaxy. On one mission, they arrived at a station where another displaced population was struggling to survive. Tivy walked through the lower levels of that station and saw movement in the shadows near the waste compactors. A child, small and frightened and hungry, a different species this time, but the same. Desperate eyes. Tivy did not call out or make sudden movements. Instead, she slowly sat down at a distance and pushed her meal toward the shadows. Then she looked away to give the child privacy. She waited, and when tiny hands finally crept forward to take the food, Tivy smiled to herself. This was how it began. This was how the cycle of compassion continued. One person seeing another person as worthy of love in a galaxy that so often chose to look away. The child ate and Tivy waited, and eventually she would tell this frightened little one the same truth that a human cargo hauler had once told her. You are not garbage. You are not worthless. You are precious beyond measure, and someone sees you. Someone will always see you. That was the gift Yuna had given her, and Tivy would spend her life passing it on, one forgotten child at a time, until the stars grew cold. Yuna had 48 hours before her cargo contract expired and penalties began accumulating that would destroy her small business. She also had 48 hours before station security reached the maintenance tunnels where 40 Kethri refugees were hiding from a galaxy that had decided they were worth less than the garbage they ate. The math was simple and brutal. If she stayed to help, she would lose everything she had spent 15 years building. If she left, she would abandon a child who had just begun to trust her. Yuna had never considered herself a hero. She was just a cargo hauler who kept her head down and did her work and tried not to think too much about the injustices that surrounded her every day. But something had changed when she saw Tivy eating scraps in the shadows. Something had broken open inside her heart, and now she could not close it again. She spent her remaining credits on supplies, water purification tablets and protein bars and basic medicine, and blankets and everything else she could carry in her arms and on her back. She brought them to the settlement and watched the Kethri accept them with expressions that mixed gratitude and suspicion, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. Elder Soharan watched her work without speaking. Finally, when Yuna paused to catch her breath, he asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them since the day they met. Why do you do this, human? We cannot pay you. We cannot help you in return. We have no connections, no influence, no value to anyone. Yuna sat down on an overturned crate and tried to find words that would make sense to someone who had spent years learning that the galaxy only cared about strength and wealth and power. Let me tell you something about humans, she said. Tivy came to sit beside her, and several other Kethri gathered to listen. We are a young species by galactic standards, Yuna continued. We only left our homeworld a few hundred years ago, and in that time we have been conquered and enslaved and dismissed and underestimated by nearly every other species we encountered. We were not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. We did not have the best technology or the longest history or the most advanced culture. Other species looked at us and saw nothing worth respecting. They called us savages and barbarians and primitive creatures who had somehow stumbled into space by accident. But we survived, and do you know why? We survived. Elder Soharen shook his head because we refused to abandon each other. Yuna said, when our ancestors faced extinction, they did not calculate who was valuable and who was expendable. They did not weigh the worth of children against the cost of protecting them. They simply decided that every human life mattered, and they fought and struggled and sacrificed to protect people they would never meet and children who would never know their names. That stubbornness is in our blood. It is part of what makes us human, and it is why I cannot walk away from you, even though logic tells me I should. Tivi's antenna trembled, and she asked in her small crystal voice if Yuna was saying that humans protected weak people. Yuna smiled and shook her head. I'm saying that humans do not believe in weak people. We believe that strength comes in many forms, and that the child who survives when the universe tries to crush her is stronger than any warrior who has never faced true hardship. You are not weak, Tivi. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. You have survived things that would have destroyed others. You have kept hope alive in a place where hope should have died long ago. That is not weakness. That is a power that most species cannot even imagine. Tivi's large dark eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away because crying was a luxury refugees could not afford. Elder Soharen was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke in a voice that carried more emotion than Yuna had heard from him before. My granddaughter's parents died during the evacuation, he said. Her mother was my daughter. She stayed behind to help others board the transport ships, and when the last ship left, she was not on it. I have tried to keep Tivi alive since then, but I have also watched her lose everything that makes childhood precious. She learned to hide before she learned to play. She learned to fear before she learned to trust. She learned that her life meant nothing to anyone except the few of us who remained. And now you come here and tell her she is precious. You tell her she is strong. You tell her that somewhere in this galaxy, there are people who believe she matters. I do not know if I can trust you, human, but I know that my granddaughter needed to hear those words more than she needed food or water or medicine. Yuna felt tears on her own cheeks now, and she did not wipe them away. She let them fall, because sometimes tears were the only honest response to pain that words could not express. The moment was interrupted by one of the Kethri scouts who came running into the settlement with panic in her eyes. Security drones, she gasped. They are coming earlier than we expected. They will reach the outer tunnels within hours. The settlement erupted into control. Chaos adults began gathering children and packing essential supplies and preparing to flee deeper into the station's infrastructure. But Yuna knew there was nowhere deep enough to hide. Nexus Station was not infinite. Eventually, security would find them, and when they did, the Kethri would be expelled into the cold void of space, or worse. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Stay here, she told Elder Soharen, I will buy you time. How the old man asked. Yuna smiled grimly by being a very loud, very stubborn, very annoying human. She left the settlement and made her way to the public corridors where she found a communication terminal and began sending messages to every human contact she had accumulated over 15 years of trading across the galaxy. She told them what was happening. She told them about 40 refugees who were about to be swept away like garbage. She told them about a little girl who had just begun to believe that she was worth something, and then she did something that terrified her more than anything she had ever done. She walked to the administrative offices of Nexus Station and demanded a meeting with Administrator Mikos Vreen, the Torvathi official who considered the Kethri vermin to be removed, the powerful bureaucrat who could destroy her with a single order. The enemy Yuna walked into his office with her head held high and her heart pounding with fear. She refused to show. Vreen looked at her with the contempt that powerful beings reserve for insignificant creatures who wasted their time. "What do you want, human?" he demanded. Yuna looked him directly in his 3 eyes and spoke clearly. "I want you to stop the security sweep. I want you to grant protected status to the Kethri refugees. I want you to remember that they are people and not garbage." Vreen laughed. The sound was cold and ugly. "And why would I do any of those things?" he asked. "Because," Yuna replied, "I am about to make this very, very public, and humans have a strange habit of caring about things that make us uncomfortable." Vreen's laughter stopped. For the first time, something flickered in his expression that might have been concern. "What are you going to do, human?" he demanded. Yuna smiled. "Watch and see." Administrator Vreen did not take Yuna seriously at first. She was just one human woman with a small cargo ship, and no political connections, and no wealth, and no power that he could see. But Vreen had made the same mistake that many species made. When dealing with humans, he underestimated their stubbornness. Yuna walked out of his office and went directly to the station's main communication hub, where she accessed every public frequency available to civilian users. She did not have authority to broadcast on official channels, but she had something better. She had the truth. She began talking. She described in simple, clear words what was happening in the maintenance tunnels beneath Nexus Station. She talked about 40 refugees who had been pushed off their world by corporate greed. She talked about children eating garbage while wealthy traders walked past without looking down. She talked about a little girl named Tivy who had learned to move like a ghost because being seen meant being heard. She talked about dignity and value and the question of what kind of galaxy they all wanted to live in. At first, nobody seemed to listen. But humans had spread across dozens of worlds and thousands of stations, and they had developed communication networks that moved information faster than official channels could suppress it within an hour. Yuna's broadcast had been picked up and repeated by human traders and haulers and workers across the sector. Within 2 hours, the messages started coming back. Questions at first, then offers of support, then something that Yuna had not dared to hope for: ships. Human ships began arriving at Nexus Station. Not warships with weapons ready to fire, just cargo haulers like Yuna's own vessel, and passenger transports and medical frigates and supply runners. They came from nearby systems and distant colonies and everywhere in between. They did not threaten anyone. They simply arrived and parked in visible orbits around the station and waited. More ships came and more. Captain Daeyoung Cho arrived with a patrol vessel that technically had no authority in this sector, but had responded to Yuna's emergency signal anyway. He formally requested observer status for the security operation that Administrator Vreen had ordered. This was a clever move because galactic law required that official operations be conducted according to proper protocols when observers were present. Vreen could not simply sweep the tunnels and dispose of the refugees quietly anymore. The galaxy was watching. Trade delegate Yizrath of the Voronex arrived for the negotiations that had prompted Vreen to order the sweep in the first place. The Voronex were a powerful species whose trade agreements could make or break a station's economy. Yizrath observed the growing fleet of human ships with visible confusion. "What is this about?" she asked Vreen. The administrator struggled to explain. "There are some unauthorized occupants in the lower levels," he said. "Refugees from a displaced species. We were simply going to relocate them before your arrival." Yizrath turned to Captain Cho and asked why humans cared so much about refugees who had nothing to offer. Captain Cho stood very straight and spoke in a voice that carried across the room. "Among my people," he said, "we have a belief that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its strongest members, but how it treats its weakest. These refugees have no power and no wealth, and no ability to fight back. They are exactly the people who deserve protection." Most Yizrath made a gesture that indicated skepticism. "But they have no value," she said. "They cannot contribute to your economy or strengthen your military or advance your Technology. They are a burden without benefit. Captain Cho smiled slightly, with respect. Delegate, that is exactly the kind of thinking that my species has spent centuries trying to overcome. We calculate value differently. We believe that every conscious being capable of suffering and joy has inherent worth that cannot be measured in economic terms. We believe that children deserve food and safety regardless of what species they belong to, or what their parents can afford to pay. And we believe that when powerful people decide that weak people are garbage to be thrown away, the powerful people have lost something important in themselves, something they may never get back. Yushrith was silent for a moment. Then she turned to Administrator. Reen, is this true? She asked. Are you disposing of children? Reen hesitated, and in that hesitation, Yuna saw her opportunity. These refugees include 17 children, she said loudly. The youngest is 3 years old by human standards. They have been living on contaminated water and scraps from garbage bins for over a year. The security sweep you are about to witness would force them out of the only shelter they have, in space where they would die. The room went very quiet. Yushrith studied Vreen with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something colder. I understood this station to be civilized, she said. We do not negotiate trade agreements with civilizations that dispose of children for the convenience of visiting delegates. Vreen looked desperately between Yushrith and the growing fleet of human ships, visible through the windows, and Yuna standing before him with fire in her eyes. What do you want? He finally demanded. Yuna answered without hesitation, temporary protected status for all Kethri refugees on this station, effective immediately. They will be allowed to remain in their current location without harassment while we work on a permanent solution. Vreen's face twisted with frustration. For how long, he demanded. Until we find them a real home, Yuna said, somewhere they can live with dignity instead of hiding like animals. And if you never find such a place, then they stay here under protection indefinitely. Yuna felt the weight of that promise, but she did not back down. We will find a place. She said humans are good at finding solutions when we decide something matters. Vreen looked at Yushrith, who made a gesture that clearly indicated she was waiting to see what he would decide. He looked at Captain Cho and the fleet of human ships that continued to grow as more arrived from across the sector. He looked at Yuna, who had somehow turned his simple administrative decision into an interstellar incident. Fine, he spat. Temporary protected status for now, but you will remove them eventually. Human. This station is not a refugee camp. Yuna nodded. Thank you, Administrator. That is all I needed. She left his office and made her way back to the maintenance tunnels, where she found Elder Soharan and Tivi, and the other refugees waiting with fear in their eyes. It is over, she told them. For now you are safe. No one will force you to leave. Tivi ran to her and wrapped thin arms around her waist and held on as if Yuna was the only solid thing in a universe that had been trying to sweep her away. Yuna held the child and felt tears running down her cheeks. Elder Sohara approached slowly. You did this, he said. One human woman stopped an administrator and a security force and changed the minds of powerful people. How? Yuna shook her head. I did not do it alone, she said. I just asked other humans to watch. And when humans watch things that are wrong, they tend to do something about it. It is one of our better qualities. Elder Soharan was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke softly. Perhaps we chose the right species to trust after all. Yuna smiled through her tears. Perhaps you did, but she knew this was not over. Temporary protection was not permanent safety. The Kethri needed a real home, and Yuna had an idea about how to find one. She just needed to convince them to trust her completely, which after everything they had been through might be the hardest task of all. Nexus Station never slept and never grew quiet and never stopped. Its endless noise of commerce and greed and desperation all mixed together like ingredients in a recipe. Nobody wanted to eat. Yuna Park wiped the grease from her hands and stretched. Her back after 12 hours of hauling cargo containers across loading bays that smelled like fuel and sweat and alien spices she could not name. She was 37 years old with calloused hands and tired eyes and a small cargo ship that barely kept flying, but it was hers, and that meant everything to a woman who had grown up with nothing on a colony world, where humans were still considered newcomers to the galaxy. The upper levels of Nexus Station gleamed with lights and luxury and species from 100 different worlds, conducting business worth more credits than Yuna would see in 10 lifetimes. But Yuna never went to the upper levels. She lived and worked in the lower sections, where the air recyclers hummed with exhaustion, and the walls showed rust, and the people who walked these corridors had learned long ago that nobody important would ever look at them twice. Tonight, she sat on a metal crate near the waste compactors eating a simple meal of rice and vegetables from a container she had heated in her ship's tiny kitchen. The food was bland, but it was warm and filling, and after a day of hard labor, it tasted like victory. She was lifting her fork to her mouth when she saw movement in the shadows near the garbage bins. At first, she thought it might be one of the station's maintenance robots, or perhaps one of the many pest creatures that had spread across the galaxy by hiding in cargo holds. But then she saw the eyes. Large dark eyes that reflected the dim light like pools of black water, and they were watching her with a mixture of fear and desperate hunger that made Yuna's chest tighten with an emotion she could not immediately name. She set down her fork and remained very still. The creature in the shadows moved slightly, and Yuna caught a glimpse of iridescent scales that shimmered with faint colors of blue and green and purple like oil on water. It was a child, a small alien child no bigger than a human 5-year-old with delicate antennae that trembled above her head and thin arms that reached into a garbage container to pull out scraps of discarded food. The child stuffed something into her mouth and chewed quickly, as if expecting someone to take it away at any moment. Yuna had seen many things in her years traveling between the stars, but something about this sight made her want to weep. She knew what species this child belonged to because she had heard the stories and seen the news reports that most people ignored because the victims were not human and therefore not important to human viewers. The Kethri. Their homeworld had been a small planet, rich in rare minerals that a massive corporate mining conglomerate had decided they wanted, and what the corporations wanted they took regardless of who already lived there. The Kethri had been evacuated, if you could call it that, which really meant they had been pushed off their world with whatever they could carry and told to find somewhere else to exist. Most species in the galaxy had refused to take them because refugees were expensive and troublesome, and the Kethri had no political power and no military strength and no wealthy allies to speak on their behalf. They were small and weak and gentle, and in a galaxy that respected only strength, those qualities were considered worthless. Yuna watched the child eat garbage and felt something shift inside her heart. She did not make any sudden movements. Instead, she slowly pushed her own food container away from herself and toward the shadows where the child hid. Then she looked away as if she had lost interest in eating and began examining her fingernails with great concentration. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard soft footsteps, barely louder than whispers. From the corner of her eye, she saw the child creep forward with movements that reminded Yuna of a frightened animal ready to flee at the slightest threat. Small scaled hands reached for the food container. The child grabbed it and retreated into the shadows so quickly that Yuna almost missed the motion. She continued to look at her fingernails and listen to the sound of the child eating real food, perhaps for the first time in days or weeks. When Yuna finally turned her head, the child was gone, and the food container sat empty on the floor. She picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the warmth that still lingered from small hands. The next morning, Yuna went to a vendor who sold information along with cheap noodles and overpriced drinks. She asked about Kethri refugees on the station. The vendor was a four-armed creature named Drex who had lived on Nexus, stationed for 30 years, and knew everything about everyone. Drex laughed at her question and asked why she would possibly care about those scale mice. That was what most species called the Kethri, when they bothered to acknowledge them at all. Una said she was just curious. Drex shrugged with two of his four shoulders and told her that there were Kethri hiding somewhere in the lower maintenance sections, probably a few dozen of them living like vermin in the walls. Station security knew about them but considered them too insignificant to bother removing. They would die off eventually or move on to become someone else's problem. The galaxy had no place for species that could not defend themselves or pay for protection. Una bought a bowl of noodles she did not want and ate them without tasting anything while she thought about those large dark eyes watching her from the shadows. She thought about small hands reaching for garbage to eat. She thought about a child who had learned to move like a ghost because being seen meant being hurt. That night, Una returned to the same spot near the waste compactors with another container of food. She set it down and moved away and waited. The child came again, and this time she did not hide as deeply in the shadows. They did not speak, but something passed between them. Anyway, some kind of understanding. Una came back the next night and the night after that. On the fourth night, the child spoke. Her voice was high and soft like bells made of crystal, and she asked Una a question that broke something inside the human woman's heart. Why do your people throw away so much food? Una did not have an answer that made any sense. She sat in silence while the child ate and wondered what kind of galaxy allowed children to starve while others threw away enough food to feed them 10 times over. When the child finished eating, she looked at Una with those large dark eyes and said her name. Una told Tivi her own name and watched the child's antenna twitch as she processed the strange human sounds. Then, Tivi disappeared into the maintenance tunnels that ran through the station. Like veins through a body, Una sat alone in the dim light and made a decision that would change everything. She could not save every Kethri in the galaxy. She could not undo the injustice that had taken their world. She could not make the powerful care about the powerless. But she could come back tomorrow with more food. And she could keep coming back until that frightened child knew that at least one person in this cold galaxy saw her as more than garbage. Una returned to her ship and did not sleep. She kept seeing those eyes, those small hands, that hungry, desperate face. Tomorrow she would return, and the day after that, and however many days it took until Tivi understood that she mattered.